Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Gaining Ground webinar series. I'm Aaron Prater, one of the students in the Urban Food Systems program at Kansas State University, and we're going to get going today here in just a second. But I just wanted to say first that Gaining Ground is a webinar series based on work that's supported by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture through the USDA and the North Central Regional SARE program. It's organized by the Urban Food Systems graduate student cohort and provides agriculture educators with tools and skills to better support urban food system enterprises. The topics, each webinar focuses on a different topic, including financing, business management, and marketing of enterprises. And again, is funded by the North Central SARE PDP under a project titled Capacity Building in Urban Food Systems in North Central Region. Today, we're going to talk about zoning for urban agriculture. Our guest speaker is Andrea Clark. She's the Policy and Planning Manager for KC Healthy Kids. Andrea is dedicated to creating healthy, resilient, and equitable communities through research, planning, and advocacy. As a member of the policy team at KC Healthy Kids, she focuses on the connections between active living, food security, and the built environment through the lens of social justice. Her work also supports initiatives of the Greater KC Food Policy Coalition, including leading the Urban Farm Zoning and Planning Task Force. She is actively involved in the Food Systems Division of the American Planning Association, and we're going to turn it over to Andrea for her presentation. We'll have a Q&A section at the end, so feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, but we'll get to them at the end of Andrea's presentation. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me today.
So without further ado, we're going to turn it over to you and let you talk about zoning for urban agriculture.
All right. It looks like you need to stop sharing your screen before I'm able to. All right. Great. Thanks for the introduction and the invitation to share some of the work that I've been engaged in for the last year and a half. As you said, I'm on staff on the policy team at KC Healthy Kids, and our organization hosts the Greater Kansas City Food Policy Coalition, which is a community-based initiative that engages leaders and stakeholders from all different parts of the food system to advocate for good food policy at the local, state, and federal level. Last April, we started the Urban Farm Zoning and Planning Task Force that had a handful of urban planners, urban farmers, and a kind of food ag attorney. And we did research and engagement around the issue of planning and zoning and how it supports or hinders urban agriculture in the Kansas City region. And in July, we published a report that I'll be presenting on today. It's available on our website. I'll share a link to it in the chat at the end of the presentation. And I would really advise taking a look at it because it's going to cover a lot more ground, go into a lot more detail, and it includes a lot of resources and case studies, some of which I'll highlight here today, but it's rich with information. So I would suggest checking it out. Today, I'm just going to share some general information about planning and zoning and then highlight the policy recommendations that were made in this report. All right, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about planning and development for those who are less familiar with the urban planning world. Most cities have a planning department. Some small cities don't, but they might have a city staff person, like a city manager or administrator that's in charge with coordinating planning activities. But planning departments generally review site plans, issue some permits, they guide development processes, and they develop long-range plans. These comprehensive plans provide a big picture for the future of a city or a community, from housing and parks to sustainability and economic development and transportation. And these comprehensive plans are then adopted by local governments and are meant to guide public and private development and investment in the city. Part of the comprehensive plan is a land use map. And it's used as a kind of a visualization of the development goals and objectives outlined in the comprehensive plan. These maps are important because they influence how zoning maps are revised and updated, and that impacts what land uses you can do on your property. The yellow and orange are more residential. The red is commercial. You can see some bright green spots for parks and open space. This light green is kind of the suburban fringe with rural density development, so more open space, less housing, the industrial corridor along the river. So this map visualizes what can be done where, and it relates to zoning, which is a tool that planners use to divide land into categories based on the permitted uses. So what you can do with that parcel or that piece of property. And each category or zoning district dictates, like I said, what land uses are allowed, and it outlines what the development standards are. So how tall can a building be? How dense can a housing unit be? What types of industrial activities can happen in this area? What types of materials or landscaping need to be done? And some of these land uses are permitted as of right, which means if you have a piece of property in that area, these are uses that you can do without getting kind of prior permission from the city. Other things are just outright prohibited. And then there are some things in the middle where you might be able to do a certain land use, such as urban agriculture in a residential area, but you need to go through a special or conditional use permitting process to get permission from the city to do that land use on the property. And these zoning regulations are adopted, again, same as a comprehensive plan, they get adopted by city councils. And these zoning ordinances are the legal documents that contain all of the information about land use and the regulations around it, usually broken down by the different zoning districts. And to change a zoning ordinance, to change the regulations, you need to, present a revised zoning ordinance to city council that gets voted on and accepted. And so to change a zoning regulations, it's a bit of a process, and it's something that we'll be advocating for, and we'll get into the details of that as I get into the specific policy recommendations. And most zoning ordinances will have at least a list of what land uses are permitted either as of right or with special or conditional permission. And some, if they go above and beyond, will have a table that makes it pretty easy to look and say, okay, if I'm in a residential district and I want to do a community garden, is that allowed? Or do I need to get special permission? And so the example here is the Kansas City, Missouri Zoning and Development Code. These days, most of these zoning ordinances are available online. So this one, that's what the example is I looked at the residential district, and under their land use table, you can see crop agriculture. The P means it's permitted. The S means it needs a special use permit. So depending what type of residential district you're in, you might be able to do it without special permission, or you might need to get special permission. Home gardens are permitted in all residential districts. Community gardens are permitted in all residential districts. And community supported agriculture is only permitted as of right in one residential district. In all the others, you have to get a special use permit. And that's specifically for CSA agriculture. So you have people coming onto the property to work in exchange for produce. And as I showed in the previous slide, these zoning ordinances also provide definitions of things. So how do they define crop agriculture? How do they define a community garden versus a CSA? The zoning ordinance will provide all of those legal definitions. So having comprehensive planning and zoning in mind, we're going to move ahead into some of the recommendations for how to best plan for urban agriculture, specifically in kind of long range comprehensive plans. When we're looking at some of the biggest barriers to urban agriculture in the region, what are some things that planners can do looking long term to help support urban agriculture in the region? And the first two are around land access. And I broke it up into two different topics. One is vacant lots, and then the other will be conservation of farmland. So vacant lots are usually, found in more urban areas, and they're really an affordable option for farmers when buying land isn't feasible, when they want to start small and scale up. They're great for, neighborhood community gardens, but land bank agreements, their leases are pretty short term, 1 to maybe 2 years, and that has to be renewed every year. And a lot of times urban agriculture isn't deemed what's called the highest and best use for the land. So something like housing or in certain areas, a business would be considered the best use of the land. So urban agriculture kind of gets treated as a placeholder sometimes. You can take this vacant lot, make it look nice, but then when a better opportunity comes along, the land bank sells the property to somebody else. And these vacant lots are usually available because of the result of decades of disinvestment from structural racism practices like redlining. And urban agriculture, like any form of development, even green development, can support and stabilize historically under-resourced neighborhoods, or it can perpetuate the displacement of residents. And so to avoid the displacement of residents and farmers living in neighborhoods, strong housing policy is needed alongside urban agriculture policy. And affordable infill housing and urban agriculture don't have to be seen as competing needs. There are a lot of great examples of collaborative projects that have brought affordable housing and urban agriculture together to create really vibrant communities. And one example of this is the Dudley Neighborhood Community Land Trust in Boston. The Community Land Trust stewards 30 acres of land in Boston. It includes urban farm sites, parks and open space, commercial properties to be used by small local businesses and nonprofits, and 100 affordable homes. And you can see here in this aerial shot where the Community Land Trust has set aside land specifically for urban agriculture. So that's one example of how it's been done in another city. And community land trusts are a great way for communities to maintain land ownership of land in their neighborhoods. They're often used for conservation purposes, or for building affordable housing, but it can also be used for urban agriculture. And we've seen that done here in Boston. It's also been done in Chicago and in other places as well. When it comes to conserving agricultural land, more on the kind of suburban fringes, there are other policies that can be put into place. And we know that we're losing agricultural land to development at a high rate in Kansas and Missouri. And you can see in this map, the green is farmland, the yellow is rangeland, and these kind of gray blobs here and there are urban areas. And the red on the edges of those urban areas is land that's farmland that's been developed. So you can see that these urban areas continue to encroach onto primarily farmland in Kansas and Missouri. According to Farms Under Threat, which is a project that looks at the development of farmland, between 2001 and 2016, they said that in Kansas, over 123,000 acres of agricultural land was developed. In Missouri, it was over 325,000 acres. And about 50% of the land, the farmland that's being developed, is called nationally significant land, which means that federally it's considered some of the best farmland in the country. And Kansas and Missouri both ranked in the bottom 25% of states in terms of their agricultural land protection policies and programs. But there's a lot that urban planners can do outside of state government to help ensure that urban farmers have access to this prime farmland for generations to come. The example that I've put here is another community land trust, Southside Community Land Trust in Providence. They own and manage nearly 60 community gardens, land used by 25 different urban farmers, but they also operate and manage a 50-acre state-owned property that's used as an incubator farm by different farmers that go off and start their own farms. Again, this relies on the community land trust model, but there are other policies like conservation easements that can be used to keep farmland in production rather than being developed. Another issue that planners can address in long-range planning is access to water. So we know that water access is important, not just for irrigation, but also to meet food safety regulations so urban farmers can sell their produce. If you're farming on a vacant lot, the land bank probably disconnected the water line, and we know that establishing and installing a new water line is very expensive. Programs that subsidize water access are often temporary due to limited funding, and a lot of them only support nonprofit urban agriculture, not commercial urban agriculture. There are other things to do like water catchment systems or borrowing a hose from a neighbor, but those aren't really sustainable long-term solutions. And there are some things that planners can do in collaboration with other departments like the water department to help urban farmers have access to clean water. For example, in Philadelphia, the city offers interest-free loans for urban farms that are installing a new water line. So if that water line has been disconnected, they can get an interest-free loan. They also provide hydrant use permits. So if there's a fire hydrant nearby, they can tap into that. And they also provide reduced water rates and reduced stormwater rates for urban farmers as well. So they're paying a reduced cost for their water. So those are some of the things that planners can do to help with land and water access through kind of long-range planning, looking at the barriers, looking ahead, seeing what policies and programs can be implemented to help address some of those problems. The next set of issues and recommendations that I'll talk about are specific to zoning ordinances. And these are policy recommendations that the Greater Kansas City Food Policy Coalition will be advocating for the next year or two. There are opportunities to be involved in advocating for these changes. And again, they're specifically related to the zoning ordinance that dictates what land use you can do, where, and kind of under what conditions. So the first recommendation is to permit urban agriculture as of right in as many zoning districts as possible. We did some surveys of urban planners and urban farmers, and as part of our research with the task force, and almost 75% of urban farmers that responded to our survey throughout the Kansas City region said that the land they cultivate is zoned residential. And residential areas rarely explicitly say that urban agriculture is permitted as of right, but they don't tell you that you can't do it either. So there's a lot of ambiguity around urban agriculture, if it's allowed, if it's not allowed, in a lot of cities, because they just don't talk about it in their comprehensive plan or in their zoning ordinance. And if people are farming in residential areas, those areas often have a lot of regulations, because people that are investing in buying a home want to protect their property values, and they want the neighborhood to look a certain way. So there can be a lot of regulations that urban farmers have to work around. If you do have to apply for a special or a conditional use permit to be able to legally do urban farming in a residential area, the process to get that permit is fairly lengthy. It can take up to 6 months or longer. That cuts into the growing season. There's application fees. You probably will have to produce a site plan with a licensed architect. You have to conduct a public hearing. And these costs really add up, especially for nonprofit organizations doing community urban agriculture, or for urban farmers that we know operate on pretty thin profit margins. So by permitting urban agriculture, including commercial urban farming, not just community gardens, permitting urban agriculture at a scale that's appropriate for the size and density and character of the neighborhood will help eliminate this barrier for urban farmers. If it's permitted as of right, then it eliminates the need to go through that special use permitting process. An example of what's been done somewhere else comes from Detroit. In Detroit, urban farms are permitted as of right or conditional use in all business, residential, and industrial districts. And they do limit aquaculture, aquaponics, and hydroponics to industrial or business districts. But crop production is allowed pretty much as of right in nearly all of their zoning districts. Accessory structures, especially season extension, is where things can get very complicated very quickly. Unlike most land uses, urban farming doesn't need a primary structure. Primary structures would be like a house or an office building or a storefront. And urban farming doesn't need that. And on a vacant lot, there just isn't one. There are no structures. But in a lot of zoning ordinances, it will say that a primary structure must be present before an accessory structure is built. So what that means is that on a vacant lot, a house would have to be built before a carport or a shed or a greenhouse could be built on the property. Accessory structures are also limited by the number. Usually you can only have 1 or 2 accessory structures in a residential area. They're also limited by type, the design, how tall they can be. So this obviously creates a big barrier for urban farmers that rely on a variety of accessory structures, including equipment sheds, season extension, like high tunnels, compost bins, wash stations, cold storage. It can become a big problem the more structures you want to have on a piece of land. Season extension is especially tricky when it kind of goes from zoning to building and codes, because building and codes aren't really sure how to treat these structures. They might seem like temporary structures to the urban farmer, but based on zoning and building codes, they might treat it like a permanent structure, which then needs certain permitting, certain architectural or engineering drawings. And again, it can become quite an expensive process to pull a permit to build a high tunnel, again, depending on what the zoning ordinance is of the city that you live in. A lot of urban ag accessory structures will exceed height and area restrictions. So like in residential areas, it'll say that an accessory structure can only be so tall and it can only take up a certain percentage of the lot that it's on. And so urban farmers need some flexibility or accommodations when it comes to these types of regulations. And accommodating accessory structures will allow urban farmers to be able to operate longer throughout the year, sell more produce, and be able to operate more successfully. So an example of how other cities have handled accessory structures is Cleveland. They have a specific zoning district called the Urban Garden District. And in this district, different types of accessory structures are permitted. They are allowed to have a larger square footage, a taller height allowance. In residential districts, they have some flexibility on the standards for the height of the structures, the materials that are used, where they can be located on the parcel. In the zoning ordinance, this is most important, clearly states when an accessory structure requires a building permit. So there's no ambiguity on whether you need to pull a permit or not based on the type of structure that you're putting up. The next recommendation is around sales of local produce. We know that a lot of urban farmers at the beginning of the pandemic had to switch their farm to market models as farmers markets were not sure if they were going to open or not, as restaurants were closing down. On-site sales became really important for a lot of farmers in urban areas. But on-site sales or on-site pickup might not be allowed or legal, depending on the zoning district that you operate in. In addition, things like mobile markets are usually not allowed to operate, park, and conduct business in residential areas. Sometimes agricultural products aren't allowed to be displayed on public sidewalks. Farmers markets have kind of the most flexibility. Some of them are allowed in residential areas, but there are some cities where farmers markets are only allowed in commercial districts. They're not allowed in residential districts at all. And based on the survey that we did, we know that not very many farmers are growing for personal consumption only. A lot of people involved in urban agriculture, whether it's a community garden or a commercial farm, they're growing to donate their products or to sell them. So there are some things, some policies that urban planners can do to help farmers get their products to local consumers. One example comes from Detroit. Farmers markets are permitted as an accessory use in residential districts as long as they're operating from a church, a school, a nonprofit center, or like a parks and rec facility. So as long as the farmers market is kind of attached to one of these community institutions, they're allowed to operate in residential districts. In addition, the sale of locally grown products are allowed on site at an urban farm. So it allows farmers markets to operate in residential areas as well as allowing farmers to sell products that they've grown on site. I know that I've covered a lot of information, but there's a lot more in the report as well. In the report, there's a little bit more detail on the issues and the barriers that farmers told us they encounter. The policy recommendations are more explicitly stated what the specific change to the zoning ordinance would be. And then there's more case studies for every issue and policy recommendation that we make. There are 2 or 3 case studies for each one. So I just highlighted some of them to give you an idea of the type of policies that we're going to be advocating for. And I'll go ahead and put my contact information up here. If you're interested in learning more, if you have questions, if you're interested in participating in the coalition and helping us advocate for zoning changes to be made, we're going to be starting in Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. So if you farm in those areas, we would love to connect with you and help bring your voice to the table. And I will put a link to the report in the chat for everyone here. And I'll stop sharing my screen and we can do some Q&A.
Great, thank you. We have got quite a few questions actually, and I'm going to start going through them. Thanks for putting that link to the report up. I hope everybody's got access to that. But we do have some really good questions that we're going to start with. So one is, how do you handle fees associated with permits, special use permits? Do you get any pushback from producers about the cost of permits being prohibitive, especially for low-income producers?
Yeah, so an application fee can cost around $200 or $300. Again, every city is different. So just the fee to apply can be expensive. If you have to produce a site plan, then that has to be done by a licensed architect. So that's expensive. And then, especially for rezoning, you also have to do some community engagement. So you have to host some kind of event with your surrounding neighbors. That can be online, so it can be done affordably. But you know, a lot of urban planners don't have experience facilitating, you know, community meetings. So yeah, applying for a special use permit to rezone or to be able to do urban agriculture in an area where it's not permitted can be very costly. And because planning commissions only meet every couple of months, it can take, you know, maybe 6 months to get through the process of providing all the documents, presenting at the meetings, doing your community engagement. So it's a way to get around some of the zoning regulations, but it's not a quick or affordable process for most people.
Sure. And then sort of a follow-up, we've got how can groups or agricultural organizations work to get special water billing for agriculture? How does that process work?
Um, so it's the water department or the water utilities that would kind of handle those decisions. Um, in Kansas City, Missouri, we do have a program. The city set aside a chunk of money to go towards grants to help urban farmers install water lines on their property. But that's just to get a water line hooked up. We don't have an agricultural or like an urban agricultural water rate. And that's something that would have to be done with the water utility.
Okay. And then I've got kind of a follow-up to some of that. How successful are people generally in requesting these variances or zoning changes or special use permits? Is that something that the people are generally pretty open to?
It really depends. And we don't have a lot of examples in the Kansas City area, or at least in Kansas City, Missouri, of farmers going through that process. I do know of one that went through a special use process to rezone his property. And it did go through, but it took a lot of money and a lot of time. And it really is done on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
So they take into consideration what your current zoning is, what the surrounding neighborhood is like, or not necessarily in a neighborhood, but what the surrounding community looks like. They take into consideration the kind of thoughts and opinions of your immediate surrounding neighbors very seriously, because obviously what you do impacts their property. And if you're going to be a nuisance, or they think you're going to be a nuisance, then they might not pass it. So they're really done on a case-by-case basis.
And a follow-up to that also, is there like an open source repository of information for some of this? So if you are asking for a variance for an auxiliary structure, are there like plans that we know have been successful before that are free to people, or is this all just every individual has to start from scratch every time?
Nationally, there are some resources available. Especially for kind of legal processes for urban farmers. Locally, we do have some resources here and there that will help break down the zoning ordinance and say if urban agriculture is allowed or not, where and what regulations there are. But one of the things that we also want to do, I'm glad you mentioned it because I forgot to, in addition to advocating for some of these changes to zoning ordinances, we also want to, the coalition wants to put together some type of resource to help urban farmers navigate these processes. And so we'll also be wanting to get some feedback from farmers on what information is most useful, what resources would be most useful. So that's something else that we'll be working on too.
Oh, perfect. So I've got a few more questions that have popped up. Are there any examples you know of where city parks permit sales of the produce? Sorry, the lights are going off. Are there any examples you know of where city parks permit the sale of produce from gardens on their land?
It's going to depend on the city. Working on a regional report means that you say it depends on what city you live in a lot. I'm not sure off the top of my head if there are public parks that allow the sale. I do know in Kansas City, Missouri, in the ordinance for a community garden, you can sell on site at a community garden, but there's a stipulation that I can't recall off the top of my head. It has to do with I think it has to be on a different lot. I can't remember exactly. I can look it up. But I know Kansas City, Missouri, does allow sales at a community garden on site, but there's a footnote to it. In other cities, I'm not sure.
Okay. Craig asks, have you seen urban farms only being allowed in residential districts if there's a single family dwelling on the lot? I guess, can you do it if there's not a dwelling?
Yeah, if you're so if you're doing it as a home garden, like in Kansas City, Missouri, you can grow produce in your backyard, side yard, front yard. But if you are doing commercial urban agriculture, the scale, intensity, and if you're wanting to sell on site or not, all factor in to if it's allowed or not. In Kansas City, Missouri is the only city in the region that has a formal urban agriculture ordinance. So that's why I'm pulling from them a lot, is because they're one of the only cities that really explicitly addresses these types of things. In Kansas City, Missouri, they did change for urban agriculture on a vacant lot. You don't need a primary structure, but if you own that lot, it's different. If you're leasing it from a land bank, then land banks also have their own regulations where, like in Kansas City, Kansas, Wyandotte County, if you are leasing land bank property for urban agriculture, you can't put up a permanent accessory structure without a primary structure. So when you add land bank regulations on top of it, it can add an extra layer of complication. Yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Sure, I think so. And we've got one, I don't know if you can speak specifically to Detroit, but this question is, can anyone in Detroit sell products they've grown in residential areas or just on urban farms?
I believe it has to be sold on the site it was grown. And a lot of times on-site sales, when they're allowed, at least 2/3 of the products that are sold have to be grown or made on site, like if you're doing value added stuff. So it really, a lot of times on-site sales, it has to be sold on the site where it was grown, and you can only sell like what's been grown on site.
There's some really great comments. People have put in some links to some resources from Minneapolis, and then again from Louisville. So there's some great links in the Q&A if people want to look at that. What are some of the challenges you face in working with urban planners and changing zoning regulations or ordinances that are more favorable to urban ag and farmland preservation?
A lot of urban planners, they just aren't familiar with urban agriculture. So if you come start talking about season extension, they have no idea what you're talking about. Some of them might only really think of urban agriculture as community gardens. So if you're growing at a larger scale and selling to restaurants, they might be less familiar with that type of land use. It's really a lack of familiarity with urban agriculture. Urban agriculture has its own jargon, that planners are unfamiliar with. And so part of it is just exposure and education to what the barriers and issues are there. Some worry about urban agriculture being a nuisance. I think that was a bigger issue before, but now that we have, more community gardens, more people growing, in their front yards, more urban farms popping up, I think that it has a more favorable perception than maybe it used to. But a lot of it is just a lack of familiarity with the specific needs and challenges and barriers that urban farmers face.
Another question is, developing land is more profitable than growing produce. What incentives do you recommend to encourage farming versus developing agricultural land?
In terms of financial incentives, I think, again, there's an educational component with elected officials and planners, understanding local food systems, the idea of community food security, why growing local food is important, and how it connects to food security, climate change and resilience, as well as economic development. And then making the commitment, that we're going to invest in and subsidize that type of activity. And again, there are ways that developments, whether it's an affordable housing development or like a commercial development, there are ways that urban ag can be brought into those projects. So also kind of not looking at it as an either or, but like, how can we bring these two things together to benefit the community? But community ownership of land is like a big part of that. So community land trust, conservation easements, allowing urban agriculture to count as open space. Things like that can all help the community hang on to their land and kind of make the decision of what they want to do with it on a neighborhood community level, instead of a more citywide or regional kind of level.
Sure. John says, great presentation. Curious if you've considered longer term land tenure interventions, open space / conservation / agricultural easements after aligning zoning to urban ag. And I think that kind of dovetails nicely into your last answer.
Yeah, and one of the other recommendations and case studies that we have is for land banks to offer either long-term lease agreements, so a minimum of 5 years, instead of year to year, or to create a rent-to-own type program, where if an urban farmer has leased a lot for 3 to 5 years, they've decided if it's going to work, they've decided if they want to scale up. It gives them time to access grants and capital to be able to purchase the land. So creating that opportunity would be really huge as well in urban areas. And I think they mentioned things like conservation easements for more agricultural land along the kind of suburban fringe as well.
Great. Somebody asked if we'd be able to make your PowerPoint available to the participants at some point in the future. Okay, perfect. And then this, I think, again, ties into the last couple answers. Andrea, having worked in KCK on food planning, I'm happy to see the discussion advancing to specific planning for urban ag. I also worked with Cleveland, which had seemingly wonderful provisions that allowed commercial farming on publicly owned property. Has anything like this been considered in the greater KC area?
There, on a more regional level, there have been some conversations in the KC Regional Climate Plan has a section on food systems, and they talk a lot about the importance of local food production as it relates to climate, sustainability, carbon sequestration, resilience, things like that. And there has been some talk of kind of creating a larger kind of conservation easement specifically for urban agriculture in some areas, kind of in floodplain areas or near floodplains. I don't know the details of it. I've just kind of heard rumors of these conversations, but that would be on a larger scale. In terms of city by city, it seems that especially like park departments are open to kind of community urban ag projects like a community garden. But in terms of like a private business renting public land to grow food to make a profit, I haven't seen an example of that in our region. If somebody has an example of it, of commercial farmers renting public land, please send it to me.
And we've got a lot of great comments that people have put information in the Q&A. I think the last question, which is a real nice way to finish, are any requirements written in the permits for urban farming to test soil for contaminants, examples lead, PCEs, et cetera, that can accumulate in the produce? If not, is soil testing encouraged or subsidized to reduce costs and increase safety?
In some models that I've seen, they do include some kind of environmental or sustainability regulations along with urban agriculture. Texas has, in Austin, they have some specifically for farming that's happening in certain parts of the watershed. And so, yeah, depending on the city, some of them do put in regulations about the types of fertilizers and pesticides and things that can be used, how green infrastructure can be used to keep stormwater runoff from entering, city sewers, to try to kind of contain any runoff. So there are some examples of other cities that have done that, but like in Kansas City, Missouri, I think most of any environmental type regulation of urban ag in a zoning ordinance that I've seen is mostly around the storage of certain materials, and that they have to be stored in a certain structure or place. Sure. Or things like that. But I haven't seen soil testing as like a zoning requirement very often.
So it sounds like in most things, it all depends on where you're at. All this is going to be a little bit of a moving target depending on where you're at and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, every single city has different regulations. So if you're farming in the metro and you have a few different farming spots in different cities, then every city is going to have a different regulation. So it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly in a regional, in a region-wide type project.
Right. Well, Andrea, I really want to thank you for taking this time. It was a wonderful presentation. With lots of praise in the Q&A for you, and we'll try and get that PowerPoint out to everybody. But thank you so much for spending this time with us today.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, everybody, I want to invite you to our next webinar. It's going to be November 17th at 1 p.m., about the same time and format, so about an hour. And the subject, and I like to finish on that last one about soil testing, because our subject is going to be building healthy soils in urban environments. And we have two guest speakers. Dr. Ganga Hederachi will discuss her research on soil contamination, and she's with K-State. And then Farmer Mike Rollin from Ophelia's Blue Vine Farm is going to discuss his experiences in building a farm in an urban environment. So we look forward to seeing everybody again soon, and I really appreciate everybody attending. Thank you so much.